In the autumn of 1878, in the silver country of central Nevada, a woman named Dora Vass paid $6 for a claim. So compromised, the assayer's office had stopped recording its output. The mine sat in a fold of the Toyabe Range where the rock broke badly and the timber rotted fast, and the men who worked it had all come to grief in the end. 3 of them were dead. One had been found at the bottom of the main shaft 11 days after he went in and did not come out. The other 2 had vanished together in August of that same year, and the official report called it a collapse, though no one had gone down to verify. The claim had no buyer for 6 weeks. Then Dora Vass came to Eureka with her father's tools and $42 to her name, and she paid 6 of them for what the mine broker called a burial ground with a silver problem. The men at the assay window did not suppress their laughter. She heard it clearly. She folded the transfer receipt into her coat pocket and walked out into the cold morning. She was 27 years old that autumn. She had come from the Comstock country, from a family of Cornish miners who had worked the hard rock since before she was born, and her father had taught her the old methods with a rigor that left no room for sentiment. He had died in the spring, not in a mine, but from the fever that took him in 4 days. His tools were in her wagon. His lesson was in her hands. He had told her once, in a shaft outside Virginia City, that a mine does not kill because it wants to, that it kills because men do not listen to it. She had been 14 years old, and she had held the candle and she had listened. What she did not yet know was that the 3 dead men had not died from the mine's indifference. They had died from each other. If you have ever known a woman who looked at something everyone else had given up on and saw what was actually there instead of what people said was there, leave a thought below. This story is about that. Dora made camp outside the portal on the first evening and did not go in. She walked the waste pile instead, reading the broken rock the way her father had taught her, holding pieces to the light and then setting them down. The surface material was oxidized gray-green, the silver long since leached from the upper levels by rain and time. That matched the assay history, which showed diminishing returns going back 4 years. What the assay history did not explain was why the original claim had been filed at all, because someone had believed in this ground enough to sink 160 feet of vertical shaft and 2 lateral drifts off the main. That much work did not happen on a rumor. Someone had seen something. She went through the previous owner's papers that night by lantern light. There were 3 men's names on the original filing, dated 1874, and the first name was a man called Rowan, which meant nothing to her then. Below the filing was a secondary assay, a private one, not from the territorial office, but from an independent, dated a month after the filing. She had to hold it close to read the number. On it was not the number she had been sold on. The number on the private assay was 4 times the territorial figure, and it was signed by an instrument man named Plum, who she knew by reputation as the most careful tester in the district. She set the paper down on the blanket. She sat with that for a long time. Her father had told her also that a mine keeps its own records in the rock, and that the men who read those records without prejudice find what the men who are in a hurry miss. He had not known he was teaching her how to survive what was coming, because what was coming had not come yet. The main shaft went down on a slight angle, not quite vertical, which was common in the Toyabe Range where the ore bodies ran in tilted veins rather than straight drops. Dora had worked inclined shafts before. Her father had sunk one for a Mexican operator outside Austin, and she had carried the pump rod sections down on her back at 15. She knew the particular disorientation of inclined work, the way the darkness skewed and depth became a matter of feel rather than sight. She went down the following morning with a half-pound of candles and her father's hand drill and his gad, which was a short iron bar with a hardened tip for testing the face, and a 70-foot length of rope she had brought from Eureka. The first lateral drift was at 60 feet. She wedged her candle into a crack in the hanging wall and looked down it. It had been worked to a face, abandoned, and backfilled. Partly someone had pushed broken rock into the near end, which struck her as unusual. A tired crew stopped work. A crew that was covering something filled the mouth. She noted it and went deeper. At 110 feet, the shaft had a problem. The timber set on the west side had partially failed, not collapsed, but rotted through at the base, so that the cap had settled 4 inches into the wall. It was passable. It would not be passable in another 2 years. She went through it slowly, her weight distributed on the ladder rungs below, rather than the compromise set above. At 130 feet, she found the second lateral drift. She found also why one man had died. There was a lamp still hanging on an iron hook at the drift's entrance, and beside it on the floor was a scatter of personal effects, a pocket knife, a length of wire, a leather tobacco pouch worn through at one corner that had clearly not been disturbed since they fell. A body had been removed from this place. Someone had come down for the man afterward, but no one had troubled to gather his things. She did not touch any of it. She raised her candle and looked down the lateral. It ran 30 feet and ended in a face that was notably different from the upper drift. The rock here was a blue-gray quartzite with a wide, clean seam of dark material running diagonally across it, and in that seam, under her candlelight, ran a vein of native silver, so bright and unoxidized that she had to remind herself to breathe evenly. Her father's voice was in her head exactly as it had always been, not mystical, not a ghost, simply the habit of a life's instruction replaying itself when she needed it. He had told her that native silver in a dark seam meant depth, that the ore body was continuous below the oxidized cap, that the leaching the assay report showed was a surface effect only, and the real formation was untouched beneath it. He had told her that in a Virginia City shaft in 1869, and she had been standing in ankle-deep water at the time, and she had not understood yet what he meant. She understood now. The territorial assay had sampled only the upper 30 feet. The private assay, the one signed by Plum, had sampled this face. 3 men had seen this seam in 1874. 2 of them had not wanted to share what it meant. She spent 2 days in the upper workings before she went back down to the second lateral. She needed to understand the timber first, because the compromised set at 110 feet was the only way in or out, and she was not going to be one of the things sealed in this mine. She brought fresh timber from the waste pile, a long afternoon of splitting and sizing, and she reset the cap on the west side with new posts she had cut from a bleached pine trunk she found a quarter mile up the slope. The work was slow and her hands blistered on the 3rd day. She did not stop for blisters. On the 4th morning she went back to the second lateral with her drill and her hammer and a collection bag she had sewn from a flour sack. She drilled 3 sample holes in the seam face, spaced 6 inches apart, and collected the finds into the bag. Then she worked outward from the face, following the seam's angle toward the north wall, and found what she had suspected, which was that the seam did not terminate at the face but continued into the north wall at a shallower pitch, running toward the west and downward. This was the ore body the original trio had found in 1874. It was not a pocket, it was a structure. She was sitting on the floor of the drift, examining her samples when she heard the sound above. It was not the mine making its ordinary noises, the groan of timber under load, the click of cooling rock. It was a foot on a ladder rung, and then a second foot. They were moving quickly. She put her candle behind her with one motion, so the flame was between her and the shaft, dimming her outline, and she held still. The man who came down the shaft had a lantern and did not bother to move quietly once he reached the second lateral's entrance. He was not young. He stood at the entrance and raised the lantern, and she saw his face before he saw hers. He was perhaps 50, with the particular weathered look of a man who had spent his life at elevation, and she did not know him at first, and then she placed the name on the original filing, and she did. His name was Rowan. He had not been in the assay office record since 1875. He said, without raising his voice, that she had no right to be in that drift. She said she had paid $6 for the claim, and she had the receipt. He said the claim had been sold incomplete, and she had not bought what was in the second lateral. She understood then that whatever legal structure he believed he had built it on the assumption that no one would go deep enough to find the scene. She understood also that the two men who had disappeared in August had not disappeared because of a collapse. She said, her voice steady and her candle behind her, that she intended to come out of the mine and go to Eureka, and she intended to bring the sample bag with her. He stood in the entrance of the drift for a long moment. Then he said she could try. What she did next her father would not have recommended, and she knew it. She took a calculated risk on the psychology of a man who had spent years believing himself careful. She did not move toward the shaft. She moved toward the face, and she said without turning around that there was a second seam at the base of the north wall, deeper, that she had found the day before, and she described it in the specific language of someone who had actually seen it, the pitch and the color and the sulfide inclusion pattern. She did not invent any of it. It was all true. He stepped into the drift. She moved past him in the narrow space, her shoulder against the hanging wall, while he was oriented toward the face with his lantern, and she went up the shaft ladder with the sample bag over her shoulder, and did not stop until she was in daylight. She sat on the waste pile for a considerable time. Then she got up and went to her wagon and drove to Eureka. The assayer at the territorial office was a methodical man named Crane, who had been in the district since its founding, and was not easily impressed. He weighed and tested her samples in silence. Then he wrote a number on a slip of paper and handed it to her. The number was consistent with Plum's private assay from 1874. It was not a surface number. It was a structure number. She said she needed to see the county sheriff, and she showed Crane the original filing documents and the private assay paper that she had taken from the previous owner's records. And she explained what she had found at the bottom of the second lateral drift. And she explained about Rowan. She had thought carefully about how to present it. She did not say that Rowan had threatened her, because she could not prove it, and the word of a woman against a man with 4 years of prior claim history was not a sufficient foundation. She said instead that she had encountered a man in the mine who had asserted a competing claim on the second lateral, and that she believed the competing claim was connected to the disappearance of the two men from the August reports. She said she had physical evidence, the filing documents, the private assay, and the sample results, that suggested the original claim had been suppressed and the ore body concealed deliberately. Crane had seen the numbers. He went with her to the sheriff's office himself. There is a particular quality to institutional attention when the evidence removes the need for argument. The sheriff read the documents, and he looked at Crane's notes, and he asked one question, which was whether the seam was as continuous as the assay implied. Crane said the sample spacing indicated a structure, not a pocket. The sheriff said he would send 2 men to the mine in the morning. Rowan was found at the portal that evening. He had come up from the mine, and he had not gone anywhere. The sheriff's deputy said later that he had the appearance of a man who had been sitting with a decision for some time and had not made it. He was taken to Eureka without incident. The legal process was not swift, and it was not dramatic. It ran through the winter and into the following spring, through testimony and counterfiling and the examination of the August disappearance records, and at the end of it the claim was affirmed in her name and a warrant issued for Rowan on grounds that the territorial investigator would not specify publicly, but that everyone in the assay office understood. He was gone before the warrant could be served. He was not heard of again in that district. If you have seen something in this story about what it means to read the ground honestly and follow what you find, leave a word below. There is another story like this one waiting for you when this one ends. Dora hired 2 miners in the spring, brothers from the Reese River country who came with their own tools and did not ask unnecessary questions, and they began the systematic development of the second lateral through the summer of 1879. The first shipment of ore to the smelter at Austin returned a figure that required Crane to recheck his calculations. He rechecked them twice. The figure held. She paid Plum a visit in Eureka before the second shipment. He was old by then and worked out of a small office near the freight depot, and he had kept his private records with the same care he had always kept them. He had a copy of the 1874 assay in a bound ledger, and she asked him who had commissioned it. He told her. She had expected Rowan's name, and it was there. And she had expected the name of one of the dead men, and it was there. And there was a third name she had not anticipated. The third name was the broker who had sold her the claim for $6. She sat with that for a moment. She asked Plum if she could have a certified copy of the relevant page. He prepared it while she waited, and she paid him for his time, and she thanked him. She did not go to the sheriff with a copy immediately. She carried it for 3 weeks while she considered what it was worth and what use she intended to make of it. She was not interested in punishment. She was interested in the record being correct. The broker had sold her a claim as worthless, that he knew was not worthless, and the difference between what he had taken from her and what a fair sale would have returned was substantial. She consulted a land attorney in Austin who had handled mining disputes before, and he told her what her options were and what they were likely to cost and what they were likely to return. In the end, she wrote the broker a letter. She told him what she had, and she told him what she wanted, which was the return of her purchase price plus a fair percentage of the first 2 shipments' value. And she told him that if he chose not to respond, she would file the certified copy with the Territorial Recorder's Office. She did not threaten legal action. She described it as a matter of the record being accurate. He responded within 2 weeks. He was not gracious about it. He sent a bank draft for the agreed amount without any letter of explanation, and she deposited it and did not write again. The mine ran until 1884, when the ore body finally narrowed below the economic threshold for the equipment she had, and she made the decision to close the second lateral herself rather than chase diminishing returns into bad ground. Her father had told her that, too. He had said that the hardest thing in mining was knowing when to stop, because men in love with a vein ran past the end of it every time and spent what they had made chasing what was gone. She walked the shaft one last time on the closing day, down to the second lateral, alone with a candle. The face was bare quartzite now, the seam run to its end, the walls showing the marks of 5 years of steady work. She stood at the face for a while. She set her hand on the stone. It was cold in the way that deep rock is always cold, unhurried, patient, indifferent to everything that had happened here before her and everything that would happen after. She came up and she took down the claim notice from the portal, and she folded it into her coat and she walked to her wagon. The sample bag from the first day was still in her wagon box, emptied and folded, the flour sack with the crude stitching she had done by lantern light in the mine. She kept it. She was not sure why she kept it, at first. Later she thought she understood. It was the thing she had held in her hand when she came up out of the dark, and it had been enough. She ran a second claim in the Toyabe Range from 1885 to 1889, smaller, without the drama of the first. A steady producer that she sold at a fair price to a partnership out of San Francisco when she was 38 years old. She moved to Carson City, where she kept accounts for 2 mining companies for the rest of her working life. She was consulted periodically by operators in the district who had read problem ground and needed someone who would tell them the truth about it. She told them. She charged fairly for the service. Mine's portal collapsed in the winter of 1891 in a snow event that brought down a section of the slope above it. By then she had not been in the Toyabe country for 2 years, and the news reached her weeks late through a letter from one of the brothers she had hired in 1879. He wrote that the slope had simply given way, and there was nothing to see there now, and she read the letter twice, and set it in her correspondence box, and went on with her day. The flour sack sample bag was in a cedar chest in her Carson City room until the end of her life. Her niece, who came to settle the estate in 1914, did not know what it was or where it had come from. Then she read the death notice, which a former assayer had written for the Territorial Enterprise, and the notice mentioned the Toyabe claim, and a woman who had gone into a mine that 3 men had found dangerous and had read the ground honestly and come out with what it held. The niece kept the bag. The cedar chest sat in the niece's house in Reno for 30 years afterward, opened rarely, the bag resting beneath folded letters and a set of her aunt's account ledgers, the stitching loosening at one corner with age. What the niece had understood from the notice was partial. She knew there had been a mine and a woman and a legal dispute that had resolved in the woman's favor, and she knew the woman had worked the claim alone for most of its life. What she did not know, because the notice writer had not known or had not chosen to write it, was what had happened at 130 feet in the second lateral on a cold morning in October of 1878, with the candle behind her and a man filling the drift entrance. She did not know because she had never described it in writing and had declined to describe it in the one interview she had given, which was to a mining journal in 1882 that was interested in her sampling methods and not in the rest of it. She had answered the technical questions and left the other parts alone. The 2 brothers she had hired in 1879 knew more. The older one, whose name was Karn, had worked the second lateral through 3 of its 5 productive years and had heard enough from his colleagues and from the assayer Crane to understand the broad shape of events. He told it to his son, and his son told it to his daughter, and the shape the story held across 2 generations was roughly accurate in its facts, and had accumulated, as such stories do, a small layer of exaggeration at its edges. The part about the candle placed deliberately behind her, specifically, had grown into a more elaborate maneuver than it was. In the version Karn's granddaughter told, she had arranged some kind of diversionary fire at the face of the drift, which was not true. What she had done was place a half-pound candle on a ledge in the rock and step in front of it so that she was in shadow while the man at the entrance was in light, and then she had said something about the ore body that made him orient toward the face. It was a thing done in roughly 4 seconds. It depended on knowing where the light was, and knowing what a man who had killed twice to protect a mine would want to look at when someone described what he thought he owned. It depended also on the 100-odd hours she had already spent in inclined shafts with her father, reading the ground in the dark, growing accustomed to the way the eye adjusted and what that adjustment could be used for. Her father had not taught her that part. That part was hers. There was a woman in Eureka named Bliss, who had been the territorial land recorder's assistant during the dispute of 1878 and 1879, and she had kept her own notes on the proceedings because she kept notes on everything that came through the office. She was still alive in 1908, and she gave a short account of the Vass case to a young woman who was compiling a history of women in the Nevada mining districts. She said that Vass had been one of 3 women who had filed successful mining claims in that district in the 1872nd and 1882nd, and that the Vass case was notable because the proof she had brought in had required no legal argument to establish that Crane and the sheriff had looked at the numbers and the documents together and the case had essentially made itself. She said that was unusual. Usually the argument had to be made and remade, and then made again to a different party, and the cost of it consumed whatever was won. She said Vass had understood that and had structured what she brought to the office, specifically, to avoid the argument. This was accurate. She had spent 2 evenings before going to Crane, sorting and ordering what she had so that the documentary evidence preceded the claim and the sample numbers supported it independently, so that neither rested on her word alone. Her father had told her once that a man who is looking for a reason to disbelieve will find one unless you remove every reason available to him, and that the way to remove them was to put the evidence in order before you spoke, so that the evidence spoke first and you were merely the one who had assembled it. She had been 22 when he said that, and he had been talking about a payroll dispute with a mine superintendent. Not about murder, but the principle held. The principle, it turned out, held for most things. The ore she had shipped out of the second lateral over 5 years amounted to slightly more than the original private assay had implied, because she had worked systematically outward from the face and found the seam's full width rather than its initial exposed face. The brothers had done good work. She had paid them fairly, above the standard day wage, because they had come without asking unnecessary questions and had stayed without making demands, and because her father had believed in paying the men who worked with you what the work was worth. The smelter records in Austin showed her name through the entire run of shipments, clearly and without variance, because she had insisted on that from the first, not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of the record being correct. She had seen what happened when records were not correct, and she did not intend to leave that kind of gap in her own. When she closed the lateral in 1884 and settled her accounts with the brothers and paid the final transportation bill to Austin, she had enough remaining to live on without working if she chose to live. Carefully, she chose to work. She had always found that the keeping of accounts which required the same quality of attention as the reading of a drill face suited her. She was good at holding many small numbers in relation to each other and noticing when one was not consistent with the rest. The 2 mining companies she worked for in Carson City found her useful for that reason. She found 3 discrepancies in her first year of work, none of them intentional, all of them consequential, and she brought them forward in the same way she had brought the 1874 assay forward, with the evidence ordered and the claim made once, clearly, and left to stand on what it was. She was not thanked warmly for any of them. The relevant managers found it uncomfortable to have their records corrected by a woman in a desk chair. She was thanked formally in the way that institutions thank people whose help they require and resent needing, and she accepted the thanks in the same register and continued working. She did not require warmth. She required the record to be correct. Her niece, sorting the cedar chest in 1914, found with the flour sack bag a small bound notebook she had not noticed before, tucked beneath the account ledgers. It was not a diary. It was a technical notebook written in her aunt's small, precise hand, full of observations about drill face characteristics, seam pitch calculations, timber set methods, and assay interpretation. The last entry was dated June 1888, when her aunt had been advising a Toyabe operator on a read problem claim and had gone out to look at the face herself. The entry described the face, the seam angles, the recommended sampling pattern. It was useful, specific, and entirely without sentiment. The last line read that the "or" is where the patient work finds it. The niece read that line twice. She had not known her aunt well. They had been separated by distance for most of her life. And the woman she had imagined from the death notice and the cedar chest contents was different from the woman she was assembling now, reading backward through a technical notebook written across 20 years. The woman she was assembling was not dramatic. She was exact. She was a woman who had learned to read a particular kind of truth in the dark and had spent the rest of her life applying that reading to whatever came in front of her, quietly and without comment, letting what she found speak for itself. The niece kept the notebook with the bag. She kept both for the rest of her life and left them with her own daughter, who understood their provenance by then, because the niece had written the story down, finally, in a letter she placed inside the notebook's front cover when she was old enough to understand that the things you do not write down. Her daughter placed that letter in an archive at the University of Nevada in 1947, along with the notebook and the bag and the copy of the 1874 assay that Plum had prepared for her, and that had never been used in any legal proceeding, being unnecessary. The archivist who received the donation wrote a brief note on the accession card. He wrote that the materials pertained to a woman who had worked a silver claim in Lander County in the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds, and that the notebook was potentially useful to researchers studying period mining methods. He wrote that the flour sack bag was of uncertain provenance and might represent a personal memento of some kind. He was not wrong. It was a memento. It was what she had held in her hand when she came up out of the dark, and the light had hit it, and the number Crane wrote on his slip of paper had confirmed what she had already known from the weight and texture of the samples inside it, reading through the cloth with her fingers the way her father had taught her to read ground in the dark, without seeing. Doe-wund, feeling what the rock told the hand that was patient enough to hold it still and listen. The bag sat in the archive box for decades in the dark that archives keep, which is the same unhurried dark the second lateral had kept, and it held what it held, which was nothing now but the powdered fines of a seam, long since exhausted the memory of their weight pressed into the cloth. It was enough. There is a detail from the first week at the mine that she had mentioned to Crane in passing during the second year of the claims operation, when he had come out to look at the seam himself, and they were walking the waste pile in the late afternoon. She told him that on the second day, before she had gone down the shaft at all, she had found a piece of broken timber on the waste pile that did not match the age of the rest of the waste. The timber was from the original construction. All of the waste was, except this one piece, which was newer, cut differently, and which she had recognized as a section of ladder rung. It had been broken off rather than worn out. It was the kind of break that happened when weight was applied, suddenly and laterally. Not from descending, but from something else. She had set the piece of timber aside and carried it to Eureka, eventually, not because she had needed it legally, but because she had wanted the record to include it. The sheriff had looked at it and handed it back. It was not evidence of anything in a courtroom sense. It was evidence to her of what she had suspected before she went down the shaft, which was that the man who had gone in and not come out 11 days before his body was found had not gone in alone. She did not say this to Crane in accusatory terms. She said it, as she said most things, as a description of what the physical evidence had told her. Crane asked her whether that had changed how she moved in the mine. She said it had made her more precise about where she put her light. He did not ask her to explain, and she did not explain further. and they went on walking the waste pile in the way that two people who respect each other's attention sometimes do, covering ground without filling it with words. The piece of timber was not in the cedar chest. It is not in the archive box either. She must have left it with the sheriff, or disposed of it after the case was settled, because it was not a thing she needed to keep once its purpose was served. She kept what was useful and set down what was not, and the timber's purpose was done. The flour sack bag's purpose was different. It was not evidence. It was the record of the work itself, the work her hands had done before any of the legal or institutional machinery had engaged, when it had been only her and the rock, and her father's voice, and the weight of the samples in her hands. There is a philosophy in the way she worked that is not stated anywhere in the notebook and not in any of the documents that survive, but that is implied by all of them. It is the philosophy of the careful reader, the person who goes to the primary source rather than the summary, who looks at the actual face of the thing rather than the report written by someone who has looked at the face and already decided what to conclude. Her father had instilled it, and she had carried it, and it had served her in a silver mine and in an accounting office and in a land recorder's office and at a desk in Carson City, in every context where the primary source existed, and someone had a reason to prefer the summary. The Territorial Enterprise death notice, which ran to 6 lines and was written by a man who had not known her but had done due diligence in talking to Crane, said that she had been notable for her precision and her reluctance to draw conclusions from incomplete evidence. This was accurate. She had drawn conclusions only when the evidence supported them, and she had been willing to say so, and she had been willing to name what the evidence did not yet support, and to keep working until it did, or until it was clear that it would not. In 1878, it had supported her, and she had said so to the sheriff, and the sheriff had acted on it, and the record had been corrected. In 1884, she had looked at the face of the second lateral and read the seam's end, and she had said so to herself, and she had stopped, and the claim she had bought for $6 had been closed cleanly, with its debts paid and its obligations settled, and the record showed a clear yield across 5 years and a legal transfer of the worked-out claim back to the territory at the closure, which was the correct thing to do, and she had done it. In Carson City in 1891, she had found a discrepancy in a shipment ledger that turned on a single line item, a freight charge, repeated under 2 different entries, the duplication not intentional but consequential. And she had brought it forward and the ledger had been corrected, and she had gone back to her account. The record, in every instance, had been the thing she tended, not her reputation, not her standing with the men who ran the offices she worked for, not the drama of the larger events that had sometimes surrounded the records she kept. The record itself, what was actually true about what had happened, stated plainly, in the right place, with the evidence behind it. Her niece, reading the technical notebook's last line for the second time in 1914, wrote in the margin in pencil, barely legible, a single word. Yes. The archive at the University of Nevada holds the notebook, the bag, the accession card, and the letter the niece wrote when she was old. The letter runs to 4 pages in a hand somewhat less precise than her aunt's own, and it contains the story as the niece understood it, which is to say it contains what was in the cedar chest, and what the niece had read, and what the former assayer had written in the death notice. After reading the death notice, for people who had known the woman, the letter says near its end that she had asked Carnes' granddaughter what her great-uncle had thought of her, and the granddaughter had said he had thought very well of her, and that he had described her once to his son as the kind of person who went into a place other people said was dangerous and came back out with what it held, and did not make a performance of it, and did not make a claim beyond what the evidence supported. The niece wrote that she believed this was as accurate a description as she had found, and she wrote that she was leaving the contents of the cedar chest with the archive because they seemed to belong somewhere that was careful about keeping things. She was right about that. The archive was careful. The things are there. The flour sack sample bag is there, in a cotton-lined housing the archivist prepared for it. The stitching held together now by age in the acid-free environment, the cloth retaining the faint impression of the samples it once held. The weight of them long gone, but the shape of what it had carried, still visible, if you hold it to the right light and look at the way the cloth is set over 140 years of being what it was. The ore is where the patient work finds it. She found it. She came up with it in her hands. She never let go.